Have you ever been blamed for something you didn't do with the whole world pointing fingers? Lucinda Briggs, a 69-year-old black woman, stood in a courtroom, her heart pounding, accused of harassing her neighbors with late-night screams. Her white neighbors, the Thompsons, painted her as a menace, a troublemaker who disturbed their quiet suburban street. The judge's gavel felt like a hammer on her dignity, and the police sneered, calling her a black old lady addicted to a dog. Isolated, humiliated, Lucinda clutched the leash of her loyal companion Milo, a scruffy mutt with soulful eyes. The neighbors had an audio clip, piercing screams they swore were Lucinda's. Yet something didn't add up. The truth was clawing to get out, and Milo, her four-legged friend, held the key. A reversal was coming, one that would turn the courtroom upside down and shine a light on prejudice. But how could a dog solve a case? Stay with me, friends, as we unravel this tale of loyalty and justice. How's your health holding up, dear reader? Let's dive into Lucinda's story, where truth barks louder than lies. Lucinda Briggs lived in a modest bungalow on Maple Street, a quiet suburb in Columbus, Ohio, where picket fences and manicured lawns told a story of order. At 69, she was a retired school teacher, her days filled with gardening, reading mystery novels, and doting on Milo, a scrappy terrier mix she'd rescued 5 years ago. Her skin, a rich mahogany, bore the lines of a life well lived, and her eyes sparkled with a blend of wisdom and mischief. Maple Street was mostly white, and while Lucinda had always been polite, she felt the subtle chill of being the only one on the block. Neighbors nodded, but rarely lingered to chat. Still, she kept to herself, her porch a sanctuary where she and Milo watched the world go by. The Thompsons. Carl and Linda moved in next door 2 years ago. Carl, a stern man in his late 50s with a perpetual scowl, ran a landscaping business. Linda, his wife, was a homemaker who seemed to live for neighborhood gossip. They were polite at first, but tension brewed. It started small. Carl's complaints about Milo's barking, though Milo rarely made a peep. Then came the glares when Lucinda's roses crept over the fence. Soon, every interaction felt like a standoff. Lucinda sensed their discomfort with her presence, a black woman who didn't fit their idea of Maple Street. One crisp fall evening, the trouble began. Lucinda was in her backyard calling Milo inside. "Milo, come on, boy," she hollered, her voice carrying in the still air. Milo, ever playful, darted around before trotting to her side. Unbeknownst to her, Carl was recording from his window, his phone capturing what he'd later claim was proof of her disturbances. Over weeks, he collected more clips, high-pitched calls that sounded like Lucinda's voice echoing at odd hours. Linda whispered to neighbors about that woman screaming, and soon Maple Street buzzed with rumors. Lucinda, oblivious, noticed only the cold shoulders and sideways glances. The Thompsons filed a lawsuit accusing Lucinda of harassment and intentional disturbance. The complaint cited frequent arguments and late-night screams that disrupted their peace. Lucinda was stunned when a sheriff's deputy served her papers at her door. "Me harassing them," she gasped, her hands trembling. Milo whimpered at her feet, sensing her distress. The neighbors' accusations painted her as unhinged, a stereotype of an angry black woman causing trouble. Lucinda's heart sank. She'd spent her life teaching kids to rise above prejudice, yet here it was, knocking at her door. Her lawyer, Jamal Carter, a sharp young man from her church, took the case pro bono. "Miss Lucinda will fight this," he promised, his voice steady. Jamal knew the odds were stacked against her in a courtroom, where she'd be judged by more than evidence. Lucinda's savings were modest, and the thought of legal fees gnawed at her. But giving up wasn't in her blood. She'd faced worse. Growing up in the segregated South, she'd learned to stand tall. Still, the whispers of troublemaker stung, and the Thompsons' smugness made her blood boil. Maple Street became a battleground. Neighbors picked sides, some quietly supporting Lucinda, but too timid to speak up. Others rallied behind the Thompsons, eager to keep the peace. Lucinda felt like an outsider in her own home. Milo, her constant companion, became her anchor. He'd curl up beside her at night, his warm body a reminder that she wasn't alone. "You and me, Milo," she'd whisper, scratching his ears. "We'll get through this." As the court date loomed, Lucinda prepared herself. She ironed her best dress, a navy blue number that made her feel regal, and practiced her testimony with Jamal. The Thompsons' audio clips were their star evidence, and Carl's smug grin at the preliminary hearing told Lucinda he thought he'd won, but something nagged at her. Those screams didn't sound quite right. They were too sharp, too repetitive. She couldn't place it, but Milo's eager barks whenever she called his name stuck in her mind. Could it be? The stage was set for a showdown. Lucinda, a black woman in a world quick to judge, faced a courtroom where truth would have to fight to be heard. Milo, her scruffy sidekick, was more than a pet. He was her family. And family, Lucinda knew, could surprise you. The courtroom in Columbus felt like a pressure cooker as Lucinda Briggs sat at the defendant's table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The wooden pews creaked under the weight of Maple Street neighbors, some there out of curiosity, others to see justice served. The air was thick with judgment, and Lucinda felt every eye on her. At 69, she'd faced her share of battles, but this one stung deep. Accused of harassing her neighbors, her character dragged through the mud. Milo. Her scruffy terrier wasn't allowed in court, and his absence left her feeling exposed. Her lawyer, Jamal Carter, leaned over, whispering, "Stay strong, Miss Lucinda. We've got this." But the Thompsons' smug glances from across the room told her they thought they'd already won. The prosecution, led by a sharp-suited attorney named Gregory Walsh, opened with a flourish. Lucinda Briggs has terrorized her neighbors with relentless disturbances, he declared, his voice booming. Late-night screams, aggressive confrontations, this is a pattern of harassment. He played the audio clips and the courtroom fell silent as high-pitched calls echoed. Milo. Milo. The voice sounded eerily like Lucinda's, sharp and insistent, recorded at 10 p.m., midnight, even 2 a.m. The judge, a stern white man named Harold Grayson, leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Lucinda's stomach churned. That wasn't her, at least not like that. But the clips were damning, and the Thompsons' testimony only tightened the noose. Carl Thompson took the stand first. His jaw set. "She's always yelling," he said, pointing at Lucinda, "screaming that dog's name at all hours. It's impossible to sleep. We've asked her to stop, but she gets belligerent." Linda followed, her voice trembling for effect. "It's frightening. We don't feel safe." Lucinda wanted to shout that they were lying, that she'd never argued with them, but Jamal's hand on her arm kept her quiet. The Thompson story painted her as unhinged, a stereotype of an angry black woman causing chaos. Whispers rippled through the courtroom, and Lucinda felt the weight of prejudice settle over her like a shroud. Then came the police. 2 officers, both white, testified about responding to the Thompsons' complaints. Officer Daniel Reed, a burly man with a smirk, described Lucinda as hostile when questioned. "She was obsessed with that dog," he said, chuckling. Kept talking about it like it was her kid. The second officer, Mark Tate, nodded along, adding, "We warned her to keep it down, but she didn't listen." Their words dripped with condescension, and when Reed muttered under his breath about a black old lady addicted to a dog, Lucinda's face burned. The judge didn't react, but the sting of humiliation cut deep. She was on trial not just for noise, but for who she was. Jamal cross-examined, pressing the officers on specifics. "Did you witness Miss Briggs screaming?" he asked. Reed shrugged. "Heard it on the recordings." "Same thing." Jamal pushed harder. "And these alleged arguments, any evidence beyond the Thompsons' word?" The officers squirmed but stuck to their story. Carl's recordings were the linchpin, and they seemed airtight. Lucinda's neighbors from Maple Street testified next, some hesitantly supporting the Thompsons. Mrs. Delaney, an elderly widow, mumbled about noise, but admitted she'd never seen Lucinda act aggressive. Others stayed silent, their loyalty split. Lucinda felt like a stranger in her own community. At home each night, the stress gnawed at her. She'd sit on her porch, Milo at her feet, staring at the Thompsons' house. Their lights glowed smugly as if mocking her. She replayed the audio clips in her mind, trying to make sense of them. Milo, Milo. The calls were too consistent, almost mechanical. She'd called Milo's name plenty, but not like that, not at midnight. One evening, as she called Milo inside, he bounded over, then let out a high-pitched yip that mimicked her tone. Lucinda froze. "Milo. Was that you?" she murmured. The dog tilted his head, tail wagging. A spark of hope flickered, but she didn't know how to prove it. In court, the prosecution piled on. Walsh presented a log of complaints from the Thompsons dating back months. He called a noise expert who claimed the screams matched Lucinda's vocal range. The expert's jargon, heavy testimony confused the room, but the message was clear: Lucinda was guilty. Jamal objected, arguing the analysis was speculative, but Judge Grayson allowed it. The courtroom felt like it was closing in. Lucinda's savings were dwindling, and the thought of losing her home or worse, her reputation, kept her awake at night. She prayed, clutching Milo's collar like a lifeline. The Thompsons' campaign escalated outside court. Linda spread rumors at the neighborhood association, hinting Lucinda might be unstable. Carl posted about keeping Maple Street safe on the community board, rallying support. Lucinda's mailbox was vandalized, her roses trampled. She reported it to the police, but Officer Reed dismissed her. "Probably kids," he said, smirking. The isolation was suffocating. Even her church friends, though supportive, couldn't fully grasp the toll. "You're strong, Lucinda," they'd say. But strength was hard to muster when the world seemed against you. As the trial neared its peak, Lucinda felt cornered. The audio clips were a noose, the Thompsons' lies a knife. Yet that moment with Milo's yip lingered in her mind. Could her dog, her loyal friend, hold the key to her freedom? The thought was absurd, but Lucinda had nothing left to lose. She whispered to Jamal about Milo's mimicry, and his eyes lit up. "Miss Lucinda, that's our shot," he said. The conflict had reached its boiling point, and the truth was about to claw its way out. The Columbus courtroom buzzed with tension as Lucinda Briggs sat at the defendant's table, her heart a drumbeat in her chest. The Thompsons' audio clips had painted her as a menace, and the police's sneering testimony had left her humiliated, branded as a black old lady addicted to a dog. At 69, Lucinda felt the weight of a lifetime of prejudice pressing down, but a flicker of hope had sparked the night before. Milo, her scruffy terrier, had mimicked her voice in the backyard, a high-pitched yip that sounded eerily like the screams on the recordings. Could her dog be her salvation? As the trial reached its critical juncture, Lucinda whispered her theory to her lawyer, Jamal Carter, whose eyes gleamed with possibility. The turning point was here, and the truth was about to bark its way into the light. Judge Harold Grayson peered over his glasses, his patience thinning. "Mr. Carter, does the defense have anything to add, or are we ready to proceed to closing arguments?" he asked. His tone clipped. Jamal stood adjusting his tie. "Your Honor, we request a brief recess to present new evidence," he said, his voice steady but urgent. The courtroom murmured, and Carl Thompson's scowl deepened from the plaintiff's table. Linda whispered to their attorney, Gregory Walsh, who shrugged dismissively. Judge Grayson sighed but granted the recess. 30 minutes, Mr. Carter. Don't waste my time." Lucinda and Jamal huddled in a small conference room, the clock ticking. "Miss Lucinda, tell me exactly what happened with Milo." Jamal said, pen poised over his notepad. Lucinda's hands trembled as she recounted the moment Milo mimicked her call. "I shouted his name and he let out this yip, like he was copying me. It sounded just like those clips, Jamal. It wasn't me screaming at night, it was him." Her voice cracked with desperation, but her eyes burned with conviction. Jamal nodded, his mind racing. "If we can prove Milo made those sounds, we can flip this case, but we need evidence, and we need it fast." Jamal called a friend, Dr. Sarah Nguyen, a veterinarian with expertise in canine behavior, who agreed to rush to the courthouse with a recording device. Lucinda's neighbor, Mrs. Delaney, the elderly widow who testified hesitantly for the Thompsons, was another key. Lucinda had overheard her mention Milo's funny barks to another neighbor. Jamal tracked her down in the courthouse cafeteria, convincing her to testify about Milo's vocal habits. "I didn't want to cause trouble," Mrs. Delaney admitted, her voice soft, "but that dog does sound like her sometimes." It was a long shot, but Jamal knew the jury needed to hear it. Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere crackled. Jamal called Dr. Nguyen to the stand, her professional demeanor calming the room. She explained how certain dogs, especially terriers like Milo, could mimic human voices with uncanny accuracy. "It's rare, but documented," she said, citing studies. "They pick up tone and pitch, especially from owners they're bonded with." To demonstrate, Jamal played a short clip Dr. Nguyen had recorded of Milo that morning, coached by Lucinda in her backyard. The high-pitched Milo. Milo rang out identical to the Thompsons' recordings. Gasps rippled through the jury. Carl's face reddened and Linda gripped her husband's arm. Jamal then called Mrs. Delaney, who shuffled to the stand, nervous but resolute. "I've heard Milo make those sounds," she said, her voice quavering. "Late at night when Lucinda calls him in, he'll bark back almost like he's talking. I thought it was her at first, too." The jury leaned forward, intrigued. Jamal pressed his advantage, asking, "Did you ever see Miss Briggs acting aggressively or causing disturbances?" Mrs. Delaney shook her head. "No, sir. She's always been kind. It's that dog of hers. He's a character." The prosecution scrambled. Walsh cross-examined Dr. Nguyen, questioning the reliability of canine mimicry. "Isn't it possible the defendant trained the dog to make these sounds as a cover?" he sneered. Dr. Nguyen held firm. "Unlikely. Mimicry is instinctive, not a trained behavior." Walsh's questions to Mrs. Delaney were gentler but pointed, suggesting she might be mistaken. "I know what I heard," Mrs. Delaney insisted, her frail voice carrying weight. The jury's expressions shifted. Doubt was creeping in. Lucinda watched, her breath shallow. The Thompsons' case was unraveling, but the judge's stern face kept her on edge. Jamal's final move was bold. He requested permission to bring Milo into the courtroom for a live demonstration. Judge Grayson raised an eyebrow, but allowed it, sensing the case's outcome hung in the balance. A bailiff escorted Lucinda to fetch Milo from her car, where a friend had been watching him. As they re-entered, Milo trotted proudly beside her, his tail wagging. The courtroom stirred, some jurors smiling despite themselves. Jamal asked Lucinda to call Milo's name as she would at home. She took a deep breath, her voice clear. Milo. Come here, boy! Milo's ears perked and he let out a sharp, high-pitched yip, Milo. Milo mimicking her perfectly. The sound matched the Thompsons' clips note for note. The jury gasped, and even Judge Grayson's stoic mask cracked. Carl slumped in his seat, and Linda's face drained of color. The police officers Reed and Tate exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier smirks gone. Jamal turned to the jury, his voice resonant. Ladies and gentlemen, the screams you heard were not harassment. They were a dog loyal to his owner doing what dogs do. Miss Briggs is no troublemaker. She's a victim of prejudice and false accusations. The courtroom was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Lucinda's eyes glistened, but she held her head high. The tide had turned, and Milo, her four-legged champion, had given her a fighting chance. The Columbus courtroom held its breath as Lucinda Briggs stood beside Milo, her scruffy terrier whose high-pitched yip had just echoed through the room, mirroring the Thompsons' damning audio clips. At 69, Lucinda felt the weight of every eye, jury, judge, and neighbors boring into her. The accusation of harassment, the sneers of a black old lady addicted to a dog, had stripped her dignity, but Milo's mimicry had cracked the case open. Her lawyer, Jamal Carter, faced the jury, his voice steady, ready to drive the truth home. The Thompsons, Carl and Linda, sat rigid, their smugness crumbling. This was the moment. Truth versus lies. Prejudice versus justice. The climax had arrived, and Milo, the unlikeliest hero, was at its heart. Judge Harold Grayson leaned forward, his stern gaze fixed on Jamal. Counselor, are you suggesting the plaintiff's evidence is entirely based on a dog's barking? His tone was skeptical, but a flicker of curiosity betrayed him. Jamal nodded unflinched. Yes, Your Honor. Those screams are not Miss Briggs harassing anyone. They're Milo, her dog, mimicking her voice. The Thompsons have misrepresented the truth, and we've proven it. He gestured to Milo, who sat obediently at Lucinda's feet, his soulful eyes scanning the room. The jury murmured some nodding others, scribbling notes. Jamal called Lucinda to the stand, a move that made her heart lurch. She smoothed her navy dress, took a deep breath, and walked forward, Milo's leash in hand. The bailiff allowed Milo to sit nearby, sensing his role in the drama. Miss Briggs, Jamal began tell us about Milo's behavior when you call him. Lucinda's voice, though soft, carried the strength of a woman who'd endured. Milo's smart. When I call his name, he gets excited. Sometimes he barks back like he's trying to say it too. It's been that way since I got him. She paused, her eyes meeting the jury's. I never screamed at night. I'd never harass anyone. Jamal played the Thompsons clips again, then Milo's recorded yip from Dr. Nguyen's session that morning. The sounds were indistinguishable. Miss Briggs, is this your voice on the plaintiff's recordings? He asked. Lucinda shook her head. No, sir. That's Milo. A juror, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, leaned forward, captivated. Jamal turned to the jury. The prosecution's case hinges on these clips, but they're not evidence of harassment. They're evidence of a dog being a dog. The prosecution's attorney, Gregory Walsh, sprang up, his face flushed. Objection, Your Honor. This is absurd. Are we to believe a dog caused all this? Judge Grayson raised a hand. Overruled. I want to hear this out. Walsh flustered. Cross-examined Lucinda, his tone sharp. You expect us to believe you never raised your voice, that this dog magically mimics you perfectly? Lucinda met his gaze unflinching. I don't expect you to believe anything, sir. I'm telling the truth. Milo's my family, and he talks back in his own way. Her quiet dignity silenced Walsh's bluster, and he sat down muttering. Jamal's final witness was Dr. Sarah Nguyen, returning to reinforce her testimony. Can you confirm Milo's mimicry is spontaneous? Jamal asked. Dr. Nguyen nodded. Absolutely. Terriers are vocal and bond closely with owners. Milo's behavior is consistent with documented cases. Walsh tried to poke holes, suggesting Lucinda could have coached Milo, but Dr. Nguyen's expertise held firm. The jury's doubt in the Thompson story grew palpable. Then came the moment that sealed it. Jamal requested one more demonstration. Your Honor, with your permission, let's show the court Milo's mimicry in real time. Judge Grayson, now visibly intrigued, agreed. Lucinda knelt beside Milo, her voice warm. Milo. Come on, boy. Milo's ears perked, and he let out a sharp, piercing Milo. Milo, a perfect echo of her call. The courtroom erupted in gasps. A juror laughed quickly, stifling it. Carl Thompson slumped, his face ashen, while Linda's hands trembled. The police officers Reed and Tate stared at the floor, their earlier smirks replaced by shame. Judge Grayson banged his gavel for order. Enough, he said, but his tone had softened. He turned to Walsh. Counselor, do you have evidence to refute this unusual defense? Walsh stammered, citing the Thompsons' testimony, but his confidence was gone. The judge's eyes narrowed. You've based your case on recordings you claimed were Miss Briggs screaming. It appears you were mistaken. He looked at Lucinda, then Milo, a hint of a smile breaking through. Are you harassing your neighbors because of a dog? He asked almost rhetorically. Lucinda shook her head. No, Your Honor, I just love him. Jamal's closing was electric. Miss Briggs has been vilified, her character attacked because of a misunderstanding fueled by prejudice. Milo's not a nuisance. He's her companion. The Thompsons' accusations are baseless, and the police's bias only deepened this injustice. Let's end this now. The jury nodded, some openly sympathetic. The Thompsons' case had collapsed, their lies exposed by a dog's loyal voice. As the jury deliberated, Lucinda sat quietly stroking Milo's fur. The police officers slipped out, heads bowed, unable to meet her gaze. Carl and Linda whispered frantically to Walsh, but their fight was over. The courtroom waited, the air charged with anticipation. Lucinda prayed silently, her faith in truth and in Milo unshaken. The climax had unfolded, and justice was within reach. The Columbus courtroom, once a crucible of accusation, now hummed with a different energy. As the jury filed back in their faces, a mix of resolve and sympathy. Lucinda Briggs, 69, sat beside her lawyer, Jamal Carter, her hands clasped around Milo's leash, the scruffy terrier resting at her feet. Moments ago, Milo's uncanny mimicry of her voice had shattered the Thompsons' case, proving the screams that branded her a harasser were his yips, not her malice. The police officers Reed and Tate had slunk out their taunts of a black old lady addicted to a dog, silenced. Carl and Linda Thompson sat defeated, their lies exposed. The climax had passed, and now, as the jury prepared to deliver its verdict, a new chapter opened, one of vindication, healing, and a community forced to face its biases. Judge Harold Grayson's gavel fell, quieting the room. Has the jury reached a verdict? He asked, his stern demeanor softened by the trial's unexpected turn. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, stood. We have your honor. In the matter of Thompson versus Briggs, we find the defendant, Lucinda Briggs, not guilty of harassment or disturbance. A ripple of gasps and murmurs swept through the courtroom. Lucinda's breath caught her eyes, welling with tears. Jamal squeezed her shoulder, whispering, We did it, Miss Lucinda. Milo, sensing the shift, let out a soft woof, his tail thumping against the floor. The judge turned to the Thompsons, his voice firm. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, your accusations were baseless, rooted in a misunderstanding you failed to verify. This court warns you against making false claims in the future. Consider this a lesson in neighborly conduct. Carl's jaw tightened, and Linda stared at her lap, her face flushed with shame. Judge Grayson continued, addressing Lucinda. Miss Briggs, you've endured undue scrutiny. This court apologizes for the distress caused. You're free to go. Lucinda nodded, her voice barely a whisper. Thank you, Your Honor. The gavel struck, and the case was over. As the courtroom emptied, Lucinda felt a weight lift, but the scars of the ordeal lingered. She stepped outside Milo, trotting beside her into the crisp Ohio air. Reporters from local news stations hovered, their cameras flashing. Miss Briggs. How does it feel to be acquitted? One shouted. Lucinda paused, her navy dress catching the sunlight. It feels like truth won, she said, her voice steady. Milo and I just want to go home. The reporters chuckled at Milo's wagging tail, already dubbing him the dog who solved the case. Jamal guided her to his car, shielding her from the crowd. You're a hero, Miss Lucinda, he said. She smiled faintly. Milo's the hero. Back on Maple Street, Lucinda's bungalow felt like a sanctuary reclaimed. She sat on her porch, Milo curled up beside her, and sipped chamomile tea, the familiar creak of her rocking chair grounding her. Neighbors who'd stayed silent during the trial now approached, their apologies tentative but sincere. Mrs. Delaney, the widow who'd testified about Milo's barks, brought homemade cookies. I should have spoken up sooner, she said, her eyes misty. Lucinda patted her hand. You did right in the end. That's what matters. Others, like the young couple across the street, offered to help with her garden, a small gesture of amends. But the Thompsons' house was dark, their curtains drawn, a silent admission of defeat. Lucinda's victory rippled beyond Maple Street. The local paper ran a front-page story, Dog's Voice Clears Black Woman in Neighbor Dispute. Social media buzzed with posts on X calling Milo the canine detective and praising Lucinda's resilience. A few users noted the racial undertones decrying the police's bias, and the Thompsons rushed to judge. Lucinda read the comments at Jamal's, urging, her heart warmed by strangers' support. See? Miss Lucinda, Jamal said, visiting one evening. You're not alone anymore. She nodded, but the memory of the courtroom's sneers still stung. Healing would take time. Milo, blissfully unaware of his fame, became a local celebrity. Kids on Maple Street begged to pet him, and Lucinda obliged, laughing as Milo soaked up the attention. One afternoon, a girl named Tanya, whose mother had taught with Lucinda years ago, tied a red bandana around Milo's neck. "He's a superstar," Tanya giggled. Lucinda's eyes twinkled. "He's my superstar." The moment felt like a reclaiming of joy, a step toward normalcy after months of fear. Yet Lucinda wrestled with the broader implications. The trial had exposed Maple Street's fault lines prejudice masked as propriety silence that enabled injustice. She thought of the police officers' smirks, the Thompsons' lies, and the neighbors who'd looked away. At church that Sunday, she shared her story during testimony time, her voice resonant. "I was judged before I spoke," she said, "but God and Milo showed the truth. Don't let fear keep you quiet when you see wrong." The congregation clapped, and her pastor nodded proud. Lucinda felt a spark of purpose. She'd been given a voice, and she wouldn't waste it. As days turned to weeks, Lucinda began mending her community. She hosted a small barbecue, inviting neighbors to her backyard. Some, hesitant at first, came drawn by the smell of ribs and the sight of Milo darting around. Conversations were awkward, but honest to start. The Thompsons didn't attend, and rumors swirled they might move. Lucinda didn't care she was done with their shadow. Her focus was on rebuilding, on turning pain into progress. The opening of this new chapter wasn't just Lucinda's acquittal. It was a community waking up, a woman reclaiming her place, and a dog proving loyalty could change everything. Milo, now nicknamed the Cat, who was wrongly accused with its owner by a cheeky reporter, had given Lucinda more than freedom. He'd given her a mission. The autumn sun cast a golden glow over Maple Street, where Lucinda Briggs' bungalow stood as a quiet testament to her victory. Weeks after her acquittal, the 69-year-old retired schoolteacher sat on her porch, Milo, her scruffy terrier, dozing at her feet. The courtroom battle where Milo's mimicry had exposed the Thompsons' lies and silenced the police's sneers was behind her. The judge's gavel had freed her from accusations of harassment, and Maple Street was slowly knitting itself back together. Yet the echoes of the ordeal lingered in Lucinda's heart, stirring reflections on prejudice, resilience, and the power of truth. This aftermath wasn't just about moving on, it was about understanding what had happened and ensuring it wouldn't happen again. Lucinda's acquittal had sent ripples through Columbus. The local news replayed Milo's courtroom yip, dubbing him the dog who barked for justice. Posts on X amplified the story with hashtags like Milo the hero trending for days. Many celebrated Lucinda's triumph, but some comments cut deeper, highlighting the racial bias that fueled the Thompsons' accusations and the police's disdain. "This is what Black women face every day," one user wrote, "judged before proven." Lucinda read these at her kitchen table, her morning coffee cooling. The words validated her pain, but also weighed heavy. She'd been a symbol of something larger, whether she wanted to be or not. Maple Street felt different now. Neighbors who'd once avoided her eyes now waved their smiles, tentative but growing bolder. Mrs. Delaney, the widow, whose testimony about Milo's barks had helped turn the tide, stopped by often, her guilt easing with each visit. "I should have known better," she confessed one afternoon, clutching a jar of homemade jam. Lucinda hugged her. "We all learn, Clara. That's the point." Other neighbors, like the young couple across the street, joined Lucinda's garden club, their laughter mingling with hers as they planted tulip bulbs. These small acts of reconciliation were stitches in a torn fabric, but the Thompsons' absence loomed large. Their for sale sign went up, and whispers confirmed they'd move by spring. Lucinda felt no glee, only relief. The police officers Reed and Tate faced scrutiny. A local civil rights group filed a complaint citing their biased conduct during the trial. An internal review was underway, and both officers were reassigned to desk duty, their smirks replaced by silence. Lucinda saw Reed once at the grocery store, his eyes darting away when they met hers. She didn't gloat. She pitied him. "Hate eats you up," she murmured to Milo, who tilted his head as if agreeing. The incident sparked community forums where residents discussed policing and prejudice. Lucinda attended one, her presence quiet but powerful. When asked to speak, she said simply, "Listen to each other. That's where change starts." The room applauded, and she felt a spark of purpose reignite. Milo, now a neighborhood icon, brought lightness to the aftermath. Kids drew chalk portraits of him on the sidewalk, complete with his red bandana. A local pet store offered free treats, calling him Columbus's bravest pup. Lucinda laughed at the fuss, but Milo's role wasn't lost on her. He'd been more than a pet, he'd been her voice when hers was drowned out. At night, she'd stroke his fur, reflecting on their bond. "You saved me, boy," she'd whisper. Milo's tail would thump, his eyes warm with loyalty. The nickname, the cat who was wrongly accused with its owner, stuck a playful nod to his cunning and her resilience. Lucinda's church became her anchor. Sunday services were a balm, the hymns soothing her soul. Her testimony about the trial had inspired others to share their stories of judgment and redemption. One woman, a nurse named Evelyn, confided about workplace discrimination. "You gave me courage, Lucinda," she said. Lucinda invited her to coffee, and soon a small group of women formed, meeting weekly to support each other. They called themselves the Truth Circle, a nod to Lucinda's fight. Through these connections, she found healing her isolation replaced by sisterhood. Reflection brought clarity. The trial had exposed Maple Street's underbelly prejudice, dressed up as propriety silence that enabled harm. Lucinda saw her role as a retired teacher anew, not just to teach but to bridge. She organized a neighborhood book club, starting with To Kill a Mockingbird, sparking discussions about justice and empathy. Even skeptical neighbors joined, their perspectives softening over shared coffee and pages. "I didn't realize how much I assumed," one admitted. Lucinda nodded, her smile gentle. "We all start somewhere." Her garden flourished, a metaphor for her spirit. Roses climbed the fence where the Thompsons' glares once landed, and Milo chased butterflies among the blooms. Lucinda's savings, strained by legal fees, were bolstered by a church fundraiser, a gesture that moved her to tears. She framed the newspaper article about her acquittal, hanging it beside her late husband's photo. "We made it, John," she told his smiling face. The past months had tested her, but they'd also revealed her strength in Milo's. The aftermath wasn't perfect. Some neighbors remained distant, and the sting of being the only one on Maple Street lingered. But Lucinda felt a shift both in herself and her community. The echoes of the trial, its pain, its triumph, shaped her mission to foster understanding, to speak truth, to love fiercely. Milo, her four-legged partner, had shown her that even the smallest voice could change everything. As she looked out at Maple Street, she knew the story wasn't over. It was evolving just like her. Lucinda Briggs' story, with Milo by her side, is more than a courtroom drama. It's a beacon for truth and resilience. At 69, this black woman faced down prejudice on Maple Street, where lies and bias branded her a troublemaker. The Thompsons' false accusations crumbled when Milo's yips proved her innocence, silencing sneers and exposing a community's flaws. Now, as Lucinda tends her roses and builds bridges with neighbors, her journey echoes in our hearts. She's not just a survivor, she's a teacher, showing us that love for a dog, for justice, can shift the world. Her aftermath, filled with healing and purpose, challenges us to look at our own streets, our own silences, and ask, are we listening? This tale hits close to home, doesn't it? We've all known a Lucinda, someone judged unfairly, their voice drowned out. Maybe you felt that sting yourself, labeled before you could speak. I think of my own aunt, a black woman who faced whispers in her small town yet stood tall. Lucinda's fight and Milo's unlikely heroism remind us that truth needs champions, big or small. It's not just about one woman or one dog. It's about all of us standing up when prejudice creeps in, speaking out when silence feels easier. So here's your call to action, friends. Don't let Lucinda's story fade. Share it. Tell your neighbors, your book club, your church. Post about it on X, tag Milo the hero, and let the world know how a scruffy terrier and a brave woman toppled lies. Comment below with your own stories of resilience. Have you, or someone you love, faced judgment and fought back? Subscribe to the Black Women channel for more tales of strength where voices like Lucinda's shine. Like this story, share it wide, and let's spark conversations that heal our communities. Take a page from Lucinda's book, listen to the Milos in your life, the small voices that hold big truths. Host a coffee chat, start a book club, or just wave to that neighbor you've never really known. Change starts with us, one step, one bark at a time. As Lucinda would say, truth don't hide forever. Let's make sure it doesn't have to.